So far in chapter 23, we've looked at the history between the Protestant breakaway from the Catholic Church, the Catholic response to that, and then also the issues within the Inquisition and how that ties into religious persecution, and as well as we've also looked at the beginnings of more of those constitutional governments, and also the comparison with that with absolutist governments, predominantly looking at France for our example within that. So we're going to shift gears and switch over back to Eastern Europe and look at Russia, something we've mentioned a few times in previous chapters in terms of how it develops as a result of the collapse of the Golden Horde Khanate within Mongolia, or run by that, which the Mongols had little impact on, or little, I shouldn't say impact. They had less direct control over the territory and used it more as a tribute state. But the one principality that kind of rose up against them was that of Muscovy, where essentially the city of Moscow is from, and then began to establish their own empire over time through there. And chapter, I believe, 21 also was looking at the addition of land as a result of trade and expansion, also going into a bit of the stuff with the fur trade and expanding into Siberia and how they were able to grasp hold of that. So we're looking at that modernization of Russia following or kind of along that same time frame. All right, so Russia slowly builds up that empire after breaking away from the Mongols and adds territory over time, increasing their influence over on the interior via trade, religion, and the military. And again, moving people further out, convincing people to convert to the Eastern Orthodox Church, and tying them down with the taxes on the furs or money if they could not necessarily provide furs. And that was essentially what they were able to do in terms of consolidating more and more power inside of Russia to kind of build up their wealth and resources. Now, while Europe or the rest of Europe is attempting to modernize and create manufactured goods and textiles to then sell to colonies in other parts of Europe and Asia and Africa, Russia is actually a little bit further behind on that because they don't necessarily spend a whole lot of time manufacturing. They spend their time essentially producing agriculture and again, coming out of Siberia, selling furs. But they're also, the biggest issue for them is they have a much bigger empire or territory than the rest of Europe. They don't necessarily have to worry about, trade with, or, looking at stuff within the Americas. Their focus is more, they have competing European ally or competing European states in Central Europe with the, Holy Roman Empire and Germanic states. They have to deal with China, Mongolia. They have to deal with the Ottoman Empire, kind of to their southern border that is continually growing and threatening them, that they're constantly at war at. So Russia will attempt to modernize starting in the late or in the 1700s. And so this happens with Peter the Great. So Peter the Great is one of the czars or kings of Russia. And so essentially he goes on this journey in the late 1690s across Europe to kind of look, let's see what has going on in these other European states, and takes a lot of his, closest advisors and friends with him to kind of see what's going on in, Prussia, what's going on in England, what's going on in France and the Netherlands. What are they all learning about? What are they focusing on to become wealthier besides just colonialism? And so he comes back and he's like, man, we are really far behind the times because they have all this money and investment and are starting to, take off well ahead of us. So we need to go and compete with them. So he decides that he's going to begin to reform Russia and make a whole bunch of changes to the country itself. All right. So some of the things that he makes them do is essentially he says we have to change our style of dress and the way that we conduct ourselves and carry ourselves. So he essentially says nobles have to dress like Western Europeans. All right, they have to learn French. They have to go to school. They have to learn mathematics. They can't grow their beards out really, really long or their hair out really, really long. They have to be cut. And he puts taxes on that. He puts penalties on that. He even goes out and this bottom picture here, okay, this image of Peter literally cutting the beards off of Russian nobles to say you need to dress and look more European than you do Russian. And so the Russian nobility is still really, really strong at this point, has a lot more power and say than the shrinking power of other European nobles, particularly, again, in France and in England at this time, while they still have some authority and prestige, their actual power is decreasing. In this case, their power is still tied to serfdom and manual labor, that they are essentially still having a very great say, but Peter the Great and then, Catherine the Great are starting to flex their muscles and create changes. Some of the other stuff he's trying to do is to modernize their military. So in conflict with Finland, with Lithuania and the Baltic states, as well as the Ottoman Empire to the south, they are constantly at warfare. And so in order to strengthen up their military, they decide to modernize it, make it look more, you know, again, European in terms of professional training, professional soldiers, military academies, things that they had been lacking. Instead of, nobles leading the military, instead have trained professionals do that. Again, more on par with, France and other European states. So they begin to invest in that. And they also decide to move the capital away from Moscow to St. Petersburg, which is right along the Baltic Sea, right on the coast that extends into kind of the Baltic Sea and then over to the North Sea that has, through a very winding way, access to the Atlantic Ocean to better trade. And they begin to call it kind of the window to the west, and they begin to put in a lot of money to build up this state, this more modern European style looking city shown here in this middle picture. All right. So to help pay for this, they decide to create new taxes on the peasantry to do that and form new bureaucratic administrations that they're going to, again, be less reliant on nobles and, again, draw in, hopefully, more wealth. At the same time, there is an incentive a little bit for Peter to kind of force the nobles to invest in manufacturing using the serfs. Again, so there's not a whole lot of free labor here. So the serfs, again, that has a long-lasting style of feudalism that does not go out in Russia as it does throughout Western Europe at this time. So, and in terms of comparison to the time period, think about the encomienda or the hacienda systems in the Americas, it's still sort of like what the serf system is in Russia at this time. Occasionally even being sold essentially from property to property, not being allowed to leave the area or marry without, again, consulting or approval of the local noble, which, again, is something we saw, again, within Western Europe and Eastern Europe, hundreds of years ago. Western Europe has kind of moved completely away from that. So while there is some investment in manufacturing, for the most part, Russia is still predominantly making stuff with agriculture and becoming the breadbasket of Europe, with wheat and carbohydrates coming out of Russia as a result, because the rest is coming out of that Columbian exchange. People are still making stuff on their own, but Russia is essentially tied in here to provide other food, so they're not necessarily making a whole lot of money on manufactured goods, but providing cheap food for the rest of Europe at the same time that Western Europe is saying, well, if we're going to get our food from here for cheap, we can just invest and make other things. So that's kind of the modernization, a little bit of Russia, to become more Western-like, but also holding on to their old-fashioned labor systems and actually making the situation a lot more difficult for serfs to essentially become on par with other, lower middle classes of Western and Central Europe at this point. Catherine the Great, the great-granddaughter, I believe, don't hold me on that, of Peter the Great, because, there's a big time difference here of about 40 years, continues to attempt to modernize Russia by attempting to do some reforms with the serfs by limiting the punishments that nobles can give them. So, like not cutting out their tongues and not, whipping them as much. But essentially, that doesn't do a whole lot. She doesn't really care about freeing the serfs. There's not a whole lot of intentionality behind that. And there's a lot of uprisings throughout her reign, particularly in the 1770s and 1780s, that are like, hey, we want more freedoms than what you're giving us. Like the ability to move off the land. Not exactly true. Even though she talks about more freedoms and equalities, she does not grant that to her people. All right. But continuing in the idea of having a bigger bureaucracy, similar to that within China, but also within, again, Europe itself, they began to hire or divide Russia up into more districts so it's easier to manage. But again, this is still run more by the nobles than it is by actual bureaucrats. All right. So then we also see down here that increase in agricultural labor through the serf labor, all right, which is something we kind of already stated. So that's the modernization of Russia. And so again, it's more in terms of look and feel, with a professional army, building a new capital to look more Western and, have that access to the West. But the actual treatment of the lower classes, particularly, again, the serfs, is very much unmodern of the times. So there is some investment here, but again, it's more on top for the higher ranking people. So when they visit Russia, like, oh, well, they're sophisticated and, cultured and, Western like us, not backwards like the idea of what the serfs would be. So that's an interesting comparison to consider here within Russia itself.